Hold on a minute. Stop scrolling right now, because if you are a veteran struggling with the VA disability process, if you have faced denial after denial, and if you have noticed that every time you find a strategy that actually works, the VA seems to immediately try to shut it down, erase it, or discourage you from using it, then this video is the most important piece of information you will receive this year. We are diving deep into the single most effective appeal strategy that is currently working for thousands of veterans, a strategy so powerful it often forces the VA to overturn their own examiners, but which the system, specifically the claims processors and the lower-level decision reviewers, consistently attempt to steer you away from, often using confusing language and misleading procedural guidance. This isn't just about filing a form. This is about understanding the deep systemic weakness in the VA's decision-making structure and exploiting it legally, ethically, and strategically. We are talking about the appeal strategy that leverages independent medical evidence to create a decision-ready claim that the VA simply cannot ignore, no matter how hard they try to push you back into the endless dark pit of the supplemental claim process. The core of the issue, the absolute foundational misunderstanding that the VA loves to perpetuate, centers on this idea. The VA examiner, the Compensation and Pension (C&P) doctor, has the final unassailable word. This is the first myth they desperately try to keep alive. Think about the last denial you received. What did it say? It probably referenced the C&P exam, perhaps stating that the evidence was less convincing or that the VA's own doctee or found no nexus, meaning no connection between your current condition and your service. The VA wants you to believe that once that C&P exam is in the file, it is the immovable object, the final verdict, and that your only recourse is to go get more treatment and file a new claim, a supplemental claim, which, as we know, often just leads to another C&P exam and another denial. But here is the truth, the absolute, undeniable, legally codified truth that the VA tries to erase from your mind. The VA examiner's opinion is just that, an opinion. It is evidence, yes, but it is not the only evidence, and crucially, it is not inherently superior to well-developed, comprehensive, independent medical evidence. The strategy that works, the one the VA hates, is the strategic introduction of a superior, fully reasoned, and legally compliant independent medical opinion, or IMO. This isn't just a doctor writing a note. This is a specialized legal document, and when executed correctly, it effectively neutralizes and often overrides the negative C&P findings. Now, let's talk about the specific procedural mechanism the VA tries to destroy, the one that allows this IMO strategy to flourish: the Higher Level Review, or HLR. When the Appeals Modernization Act, or AMA, came into effect, it created 3 lanes for appeal: Supplemental Claim, Higher Level Review, and the Board of Veterans' Appeals, BVA. The VA loves the supplemental claim lane because it allows them to kick the can down the road, order another C&P exam, and maintain control over the evidence development process. They can send you to a doctor they pay, a doctor who often uses standardized templates that are designed to find against the nexus. But the HLR, the Higher Level Review, is a different beast entirely. It's an appeal based only on the evidence that was already in the file when the decision was made. You cannot introduce new evidence in the HLR lane, and this is where the VA tries to trip you up. They will tell you, often in the denial letter itself, or if you call the 1-800 number, that if you have new evidence, like your powerful IMO, you must file a supplemental claim. They make this sound like a rule, a non-negotiable requirement. This is the first massive procedural lie they deploy to steer you away from the path that actually works. The reality is that if you already have a powerful, favorable IMO, or if you acquire one before, the initial decision is finalized, or even if you are appealing a decision from the old legacy system, The VA's attempt to funnel you into the supplemental claim lane is often a tactic of delay and obfuscation. But the true power of the HLR and the reason the VA attempts to erase its utility lies in the duty to assist error and the specialized, targeted use of the HLR to identify a clear mistake made by the initial reviewer, a mistake that is often tied directly to the weight given to the evidence. The VA tries to paint the HLR as a simple check for clerical errors, but it is far more potent. It is an opportunity for a senior reviewer, a decision review officer, DRO, to review the entire claim file de novo, meaning from scratch, and determine if the initial reviewer followed the law. The strategy that works is not just getting an IMO, it is introducing that IMO, getting denied because the VA examiner is given undue weight, and then immediately filing an HLR, alleging that the VA failed its duty to assist by not adequately considering or weighing the probates. Value of your independent evidence. This forces the DRO to look at the conflict of evidence, the VA doctor versus your doctor, and if your doctor's rationale is superior, the DRO is legally bound to either grant the claim or order a specific remedy, often a new C&P exam with specific instructions, which is still a massive win because it shows the initial denial was flawed. The VA wants you to skip this HLR step, believing it's useless if you have an IMO, which is fundamentally incorrect. The HLR forces accountability on the previous decision maker. Let's dissect the second major component of this strategy, the one they hate, the quality of the independent medical opinion itself. The VA tries to dilute the impact of IMOs by implying that any doctor's note is just cherry-picked evidence. They want to set up a false equivalency between a quick templated C&P exam and a deeply researched IMO. To combat this, your IMO must be a legal weapon, not just a medical opinion. It must explicitly address the elements of service connection, which are a current disability, an in-service event or injury, and a nexus, the link between the two. The VA hates an IMO that clearly and unequivocally states, it is more likely than not that the veteran's condition is directly related to their service, and then provides the detailed medical literature, the specific diagnostic codes, and the chronological breakdown of the veteran's service records and medical history to support that conclusion. The VA's goal is to find any tiny loophole. Did the doctor review the entire C file? Was the doctor qualified? Did the opinion rely on sound medical principles? If your IMO is airtight, comprehensive, and addresses every potential counter-argument the C&P examiner might raise, the VA's internal reviewers have a significantly harder time dismissing it as mere private evidence. They want simple, vague letters. We give them complex, defensible dissertations. The VA tries to erase the efficacy of this strategy by manipulating the concept of favorable findings. This is the third pillar they want you to overlook. When the VA reviews your claim, they often find certain facts in your favor. Maybe they agree you have a current diagnosis, or maybe they agree you had an injury in service, but they deny the nexus. These are called favorable findings. The VA's internal guidance often downplays the binding nature of these findings, suggesting they can be easily revisited or ignored in future claims. But the strategy that works hinges on isolating and protecting those favorable findings. If the VA agrees you have a current condition, you do not want to refile a supplemental claim that forces them to relitigate that point. Instead, you appeal the nexus denial specifically. By using the HLR, you are not asking them to reevaluate the diagnosis. You're asking them to reevaluate the weight of the evidence regarding the link. The VA hates this because it narrows their field of attack. They prefer a broad, open supplemental claim where they can challenge every element again, hoping you miss a piece of evidence or that a new C&P examiner changes the favorable finding you already secured. The successful strategy is surgical. Lock in the favorable findings and use the IMO to attack the single point of failure, the nexus, through the controlled environment of the HLR or direct BVA appeal. Let's talk about the specific language VA employees use to try and divert you. When you call the 1-800 number or speak to a Veterans Service Representative, VSR, they are often trained to use phrases that push you toward the supplemental claim. They might say, "Since you have new evidence, the only path forward is the supplemental claim." Or, "The HLR is only for clerical errors. It won't help you with new medical information." This is technically correct if found. The new medical information was not in the file at the time of the denial. But what if the negative C&P exam was clearly inadequate? What if the examiner failed to review key service records? The strategy that works uses the IMO, even if acquired later, to frame the original decision as an error of law or fact, because the VA failed its duty to assist. We argue the VA should have provided a better C&P exam or should have sought clarification. The IMO in this context is not just new evidence, it is the proof that the original decision was flawed and that the VA failed its duty. The VA tries to erase this interpretation by insisting on the rigid definition of new and relevant evidence only applying to the supplemental claim. When you hear the VA representative say you must file a supplemental claim, recognize it as a red flag designed to slow you down and restart the cycle. The HLR, used strategically, bypasses the VSRs and puts the file directly in front of a senior decision-maker who is trained to look for procedural errors, which a poorly reasoned C&P exam absolutely is. The fifth critical element they try to bury is the power of the specific instruction in the HLR lane. If you file an HLR and the DRO agrees that the initial C&P exam was inadequate, perhaps the doctor didn't review your lay evidence, or they said a critical medical record, the DRO doesn't just grant the claim. Instead, they identify a duty to assist error and return the claim for correction. This correction often involves ordering a new C&P exam, but here is the key. The DRO can provide specific binding instructions to the new examiner. They can tell the new doctor, "You must review the veteran's independent medical opinion and address the specific rationale used by the private physician." This is the procedural poison pill the VA hates. It prevents the next C&P examiner from simply using their template and ignoring the IMO. It forces them to engage with the superior evidence. The VA prefers the supplemental claim route, because if you file a supplemental claim, they order a new C&P exam without those specific instructions, allowing the new examiner to simply ignore your IMO again, perpetuating the cycle of denial. By using the HLR first, even if it results in a remand, you have gained leverage and forced the VA to acknowledge the superior quality of your evidence, setting the stage for an inevitable grant. Let's discuss the absolute necessity of lay evidence synchronization, the sixth element the VA consistently minimizes. Lay evidence is your testimony, statements from friends, family, or fellow service members. The VA loves to dismiss lay evidence as biased or non-medical. They will say, while the veteran provided lay statements, medical evidence is required for a nexus. This is partially true, but the VA tries to erase the legal requirement that the C&P examiner must consider lay evidence, especially concerning the onset, severity, and chronicity of symptoms. The strategy that works involves synchronizing your IMO with your lay statements. Your IMO should explicitly reference and rely upon your lay evidence. For example, if your lay statement describes the date you started experiencing severe knee pain after a specific training incident, your IMO should confirm that the medical literature supports that type of injury having a delayed onset and link the medical findings directly back to your lay testimony. When the C&P examiner fails to mention or discuss your lay evidence, that is a procedural error, a clear violation of the duty to assist. The VA hates this because it's a simple, undeniable error that an HLR reviewer can spot immediately. They want the medical evidence and lay evidence to exist in two separate silos. The successful strategy forces them to intersect and reinforce each other, making the C&P examiner's failure to address them a fatal flaw in the denial. The seventh procedural tactic the VA tries to dismantle is the direct appeal to the Board of Veterans' Appeals, or BVA, specifically using the evidence submission lane. Remember, the AMA gave us 3 lanes. If you have a powerful IMO ready and you believe the initial regional office review will simply ignore it, you have the option to bypass the HLR and supplemental claim lanes entirely and go straight to the BVA, choosing the evidence submission docket. The VA discourages this because the BVA is staffed by administrative law judges who are far more sophisticated in legal analysis than the VSRs or DROs at the regional office. They are trained to weigh conflicting medical evidence. By going straight to the BVA with your comprehensive IMO, you force the VA to spend significant resources defending a potentially flawed C&P exam against superior evidence in a formal legal setting. The VA prefers you stay at the regional office level, where they can control the process and the decision-makers are less inclined to overturn their own internal medical opinions. The successful strategy recognizes that for complex, high-value claims, the fastest route to a grant is often the one that forces the highest level of legal scrutiny, even if the wait time is longer. The VA tries to erase the BVA path as a viable first appeal step, but for the veteran with overwhelming evidence, it is the nuclear option that gets results. Now we need to talk about the concept of equally probative evidence, the legal phrase that underpins why this appeal strategy is so effective and why the VA constantly tries to muddy the waters. The law states that when there is conflicting medical evidence, say a negative C&P exam and a positive IMO, the VA cannot simply side with its own doctor. It must weigh the probative value of both opinions. The probative value means how convincing, how well reasoned, and how thorough the opinion is. If the C&P examiner provides a 1-paragraph conclusion with no rationale, and your IMO provides a 10-page analysis citing medical journals and reviewing the entire C file, the IMO is clearly superior or more probative. The VA tries to erase this legal concept by creating an internal culture that inherently favors the VA-paid examiner, suggesting a presumption of correctness. The strategy that works is to make your IMO so detailed, so undeniable, that the conflict of evidence is not equal. It is clearly skewed in your favor. If the evidence is truly equal, the tie goes to the veteran, but the goal is to make the evidence overwhelmingly unequal in favor of the veteran. This is why the VA hates the comprehensive IMO. It exposes the often superficial nature of their C&P exams. Let's expand on the procedural maneuvers the VA deploys when they realize you have executed this strategy perfectly. When you file the HLR and they find a duty to assist error because the C&P was inadequate, the claim is remanded. A remand is not a denial, but the VA often tries to frame it as a setback, suggesting you are back to square one. This is false. A remand is a tactical victory. It means the VA has admitted the previous decision was flawed and must be corrected. However, the VA often tries to use the remand process to their advantage by sending you to another C&P exam with a doctor who is known for being hostile to service connection, or by providing vague instructions to the new examiner. The strategy that works involves immediately scrutinizing the remand instructions. If the instructions are vague, or if the new C&P exam ignores the instructions from the DRO, you immediately appeal that new exam as well. You maintain the pressure, ensuring that every procedural step the VA takes is held accountable to the specific requirements set forth in the remand. The VA wants you to relax and trust the process after a remand. The successful veteran treats the remand as a new battlefield where vigilance is paramount. Consider the specific phrasing the VA uses in their denial letters to try and invalidate your IMO. They often use terms like, "The private physician's opinion is noted. However, it is not afforded greater weight than the VA examiner's opinion because the private physician did not have access to the full VA claims file. Or, the private physician's opinion is based primarily on the veteran's subjective reporting. These are canned phrases designed to dismiss the evidence without actually engaging with its substance. The strategy that works preemptively strikes these arguments. Your IMO must explicitly state, "I have reviewed the veteran's entire C file, including service treatment records, post-service medical records, and all prior C&P examination reports." Furthermore, it must explicitly state that the opinion is based not just on the veteran's reporting, but on objective medical findings, diagnostic testing, and established medical literature. When the VA uses these canned dismissal phrases and your IMO clearly refutes them in advance, the HLR reviewer or BVA judge is left with no choice but to recognize the superior probative value of your evidence. The VA tries to erase the power of preemption. We embrace it. Another often overlooked aspect the VA attempts to suppress is the use of the HLR for increasing an existing rating, not just establishing service connection. If you are rated at 30% for a condition and your symptoms have clearly worsened, the VA often forces you into a supplemental claim, which can trigger a review of your entire condition, potentially leading to a reduction if the new C&P examiner is aggressive. The strategy that works involves using the HLR when the initial rating decision clearly failed to consider the full severity of your symptoms at the time of the claim. If you had evidence in the file, like private treatment notes showing severe functional impairment, and the initial reviewer only granted 30%, you file an HLR, arguing the initial rating was too low based on the evidence already present. This limits the review to the initial decision and prevents the VA from ordering a broad, potentially harmful new C&P exam. The VA tries to push all rating increases into the supplemental claim route, which opens up the possibility of reduction. The HLR used strategically for rating increases is a defensive maneuver the VA tries to eliminate. Let's discuss the concept of the law of the case, a powerful legal doctrine the VA tries to ignore. Once a fact is established in your favor, say the VA concedes that a certain event happened in service, that fact should generally be binding in all subsequent appeals related to that claim. The VA often tries to relitigate established facts in subsequent supplemental claims, hoping a new VSR or reviewer misses the previous concession. The strategy that works is to explicitly reference the specific decision dates and paragraphs where the VA conceded a favorable finding. When you file your HLR, you explicitly state, "The fact of an in-service injury on date has already been established and is the law of the case. The only issue is the nexus." This forces the reviewer to focus solely on the nexus, preventing the VA from wasting time and resources challenging facts they have already admitted. The VA attempts to erase the binding nature of their own decisions, but the successful appeal strategy locks those findings down immediately. The procedural pushback you will receive often centers on the idea of stale evidence. If you wait too long after a denial to file an appeal, or if your evidence is old, the VA will try to argue that the evidence is no longer relevant to your current condition. The strategy that works is ensuring your IMO, even if acquired years later, addresses the historical context. The independent medical professional must explicitly state that the current condition is a direct, continuous progression of the service-connected event, thereby bridging any gap in time. The VA tries to erase the continuity of symptoms by demanding recent, specific evidence. A powerful IMO defeats this by providing a robust medical bridge spanning the years, making the stale evidence argument irrelevant. We must also address the VA's consistent attempt to minimize the role of specialized medical expertise. If your condition is complex, say a rare neurological disorder or a highly specific orthopedic issue, the VA often sends you to a general practitioner for the C&P exam. When you submit an IMO from a specialist in that specific field, e.g., a board-certified neurologist for a neurological claim, the VA tries to argue that the specialist's opinion is not automatically superior. This is the fourth major lie. The law and BVA precedent consistently hold that the opinion of a specialist, especially one who has treated the veteran over time, carries greater weight than a general examiner, provided the opinion is well-reasoned. The VA tries to erase this hierarchy of expertise. The successful appeal strategy highlights the specialist status of the IMO provider and explicitly contrasts their deep knowledge with the general nature of the C&P examiner's credentials, making the probative value argument undeniable. The VA also uses the complexity of the filing system to try and break your will, attempting to erase the strategic path through sheer exhaustion. They will send confusing letters, fail to acknowledge receipt of documents, or misfile evidence, all of which force you to spend hours chasing down procedural errors. The strategy that works is meticulous documentation. Every single document submitted, whether it's the HLR form, the IMO, or supporting lay statements, must be submitted via a method that generates a verifiable date stamp and receipt, e.g., fax with confirmation, certified mail, or upload via the VA website with a screenshot. When the VA inevitably claims they never received a critical piece of evidence, you must have the immediate proof to counter their claim, which then becomes a new basis for a duty to assist error in a subsequent HLR or BVA appeal. The VA wants you to rely on faith. The successful strategy relies on receipts and verifiable timestamps. Let's discuss how the VA tries to undermine the strategy through the concept of independent medical evidence versus treating physician evidence. Sometimes the VA argues that an IMO from a doctor who has never treated you is less credible than the C&P examiner. Conversely, if the IMO comes from your treating physician, they argue that the treating physician is biased in your favor. This is a classic catch-22 the VA loves to deploy. The strategy that works involves ensuring the IMO doctor, whether treating or independent, explicitly addresses the potential for bias and confirms their opinion is based solely on the objective medical facts and literature adhering to the highest standards of medical ethics. If it's your treating physician, they must transition from a treating role to a forensic role in the IMO, clearly stating, "Based on my objective review of the medical facts and setting aside my role as treating physician, the nexus is established." This preemptive language neutralizes the VA's attempts to erase the credibility of the opinion based on the relationship. The VA often attempts to erase the concept of effective date when a claim is finally granted. When a grant is issued after a long appeal, the effective date determines how much retroactive pay you receive. The VA often defaults to the date of the successful appeal rather than the date of the original flawed claim. The successful appeal strategy must explicitly preserve the earliest possible effective date throughout the entire appeal process. By maintaining the appeal continuity, using HLR, BVA, and avoiding filing new, separate supplemental claims unless absolutely necessary, you ensure that the eventual grant relates back to the initial date of filing, maximizing your back pay. The VA tries to push you into filing new claims, which severs this continuity. The HLR pathway maintains continuity of the original claim, which is the key to protecting that early effective date. We must also recognize the VA's attempts to erase the significance of specific VA forms. The VA loves to push veterans toward the intent to file form, which is crucial for establishing an early date. However, they often fail to adequately explain how the various appeal forms, the 20-096 for HLR, the 20-095 for supplemental claim, and the 20-182 for BVA, interact with the intent to file. The strategy that works is ensuring that the chosen appeal path, HLR or BVA, is filed within 1 year of the denial, preserving the intent to file date. If you miss that 1-year window, the VA tries to force you into a brand new supplemental claim with a brand new effective date, erasing the value of your initial intent to file. The successful strategy involves meticulous tracking of deadlines and selecting the appropriate appeal form to maintain the claim's lineage. Finally, the VA tries to erase the potential for clear and unmistakable error, or CUE. A CUE is a decision that was so clearly wrong based on the law and facts at the time it was made that it can be overturned at any time, even decades later. The VA actively discourages veterans from pursuing CUE claims because they are resource-intensive and often result in massive retroactive pay awards. The strategy that works involves recognizing that a CUE argument is often the ultimate expression of the erased strategy. If the VA denied your claim based on a C&P exam that demonstrably ignored binding legal precedent or a specific favorable piece of evidence that was in the file, that may be a CUE. The VA tries to frame CUE as impossible to prove, but when the IMO is overwhelmingly superior and the C&P examiner's rationale is non-existent, the seeds of a CUE argument are sown, even if you initially pursue the HLR or BVA path. The overarching lesson here is that the VA, as a large bureaucratic entity, operates on the path of least resistance. They want you to follow the most passive, time-consuming route, the supplemental claim treadmill, because it allows them to maintain control over the evidence and the timeline. The strategy that works, the one they constantly try to erase, is the aggressive, surgical, and legally precise deployment of superior independent medical evidence, primarily the comprehensive IMO, coupled with the strategic use of the higher-level review to force accountability on the initial decision-maker, or the direct appeal to the BVA to force judicial scrutiny. You must treat your claim not as a medical request, but as a legal argument. You are not asking for a favor. You are demanding the benefits you earned, backed by evidence that is so powerful, so detailed, and so legally compliant that the VA's internal reviewers are compelled by law to overturn their own doctors. Do not let the VA dictate your path. Understand the rules. Use the HLR to identify the procedural flaws. Introduce the superior IMO to overwhelm the inadequate C&P exam, and maintain relentless pressure until the grant is secured, protecting your effective date every step of the way. This is the strategy they try to bury, and it is the strategy that wins.